Reading is interpretation. A poem well read is a poem well understood. In this podcast, brought to you by the Literary Life Podcast, poet Thomas Banks will help you increase your love and understanding of poetry. Poetry is not a silent endeavor. It's meant to be heard, and more importantly, it's meant to be recited out loud. Join us now as poet Thomas Banks presents The Well-Read Poem.
Hello, and welcome to The Well-Read Poem. Today we're going to be continuing our theme of poems of familial relations. Last week I read you and talked at some length about Forefathers by Edmund Blunden, and today I'm going to be reading a not very well-known poem by a very well-known writer. Today's poem is entitled To My Mother by Robert Louis Stevenson. And this is not a major work, and it's very small in scope. It's all of 4 lines long, written in almost kind of a nursery rhyme form. A lot of Stevenson's poetry has the simplicity of nursery rhymes. And this poem in some ways might be misleading if you take it too much at face value, because it is a tender-hearted and indeed almost easy to dismiss as sentimental type of poem. In fact, I have seen, where it's mentioned critically at all, it tends to be written off as just kind of twaddle, sentimental trash, which I don't think is fair at all. Actually, I think it's a very fine thing in its small, unpretentious sort of way. You might get the wrong impression, though, from this poem that because it's a wistful and sort of nostalgic poem in a very ordinary and healthy sort of way, that it's written by someone whose childhood was one of unexampled, perfect happiness. Where, the family is prosperous, you have everything you need, your parents and you and your siblings are all drawn together by perfect bonds of affection, and looking back on your childhood as an adult, you almost wish that you could return to it again. That's not, I think, at all the point that Stevenson is trying to make. It is a very sweet-natured poem, but we shouldn't suppose from that there was no darkness in Stevenson's childhood. His childhood was, his parents were good people. He never says otherwise, and he did write occasionally about his upbringing in some memoiristic essays in later life. You can find some of those in his essay collection, Memories and Portraits, and elsewhere. He was a Victorian child, though. He's born in 1850, kind of right in the middle of the Victorian era. And his family is among the fairly prosperous, not hugely wealthy, but, adequately provided for, respectable middle class of Edinburgh, Scotland. And like many Victorian children of his class, he was mainly raised by his nurse, more by his nurse perhaps than his parents. His nurse, by the name of Alison Cunningham, was very influential on his later imagination, on his imaginative maturity, because of the stories she told him. She told him stories about, the old Covenanter days of Scotland back in the time of the religious wars, and, with the Stuarts and Dundee and William of Orange and, the Glencoe massacre and all that kind of thing. She read him the Bible. He belongs to a good, sort of stalwart Presbyterian family. She read him stories from the great Fox's Book of Martyrs, which is a Protestant book of martyrology, and the stories of sufferings in the days of Queen Mary and the Tudors. And she also was fond of reading him tracts about eternal damnation and other things that maybe forcing them in large quantities on a small child isn't the kindest thing to do. So Stevenson acknowledged that his nurse was quite the influence on him later on, but maybe in some ways that he might not have wished for. So all of that as a preface to guiding someone away from the misjudgment that Stevenson writing here in the first person is describing his childhood with the intention of the reader believing that his childhood was perfectly happy and all sunshine and no clouds. Anyway, all that aside, To My Mother by Robert Louis Stevenson. You too, my mother, read my rhymes for love of unforgotten times, and you may chance to hear once more the little feet along the floor. And this poem, as I said, it has the simplicity of a nursery rhyme. It has an AABB rhyme scheme. It's written in iambic tetrameter. Iambic tetrameter is one of the most common of English poetical meters. And yeah, it doesn't really need much in the way of interpretation since I've given a bit of background already, and I suppose I'll read it once more. And it's one that's easily committed to memory as well, if you are the kind of person who likes to commit poetry to memory. To My Mother by Robert Louis Stevenson. You too, my mother, read my rhymes for love of unforgotten times, and you may chance to hear once more the little feet along the floor. This has been the Well-Read Poem. Thank you very much.
This has been The Well-Read Poem with poet Thomas Banks, brought to you by the Literary Life podcast. For show notes and the text of the poem, visit theliterary.life. To find out more about Thomas Banks and the poetry resources he offers, go to houseofhumaneletters.com. This podcast is patron-supported. Visit patreon.com/theliterarylife to find out how you can support this podcast and get additional bonus content, including monthly live poetry explications. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review. Thank you for listening.